My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I speak to you today not only as the president of Burkina Faso, but as a man who carries a heavy responsibility before God and before millions of people whose lives depend on the decisions of their leaders. I speak to Muslims, I speak to Christians, I speak to the leaders of the Sahel, I speak to the world, and I speak to every believer who understands that power without conscience is one of the most dangerous forces on earth. Many people imagine that international treaties are only about economics, diplomacy, or strategy. They think they are numbers on paper, agreements between governments, or signatures exchanged in conference halls. But the truth is far deeper than that. A single treaty can determine who controls the minerals beneath the soil of a nation. It can determine whether a country grows stronger or slowly becomes dependent on outside powers. It can determine whether a generation grows up in dignity or in poverty. For decades, Africa has signed hundreds of agreements involving trade, mining, military cooperation, and economic partnerships with powerful countries and multinational corporations. Many of these agreements were presented as opportunities for development. They were described as paths toward modernization and prosperity. Yet the results have often told a very different story. Across the African continent, resources worth trillions of dollars have been extracted from the ground. Gold, cobalt, uranium, diamonds, oil, and many other valuable minerals have flowed out of Africa. But in many places, the people living on that same land remained poor. Villages stood beside mines worth billions of dollars, yet the communities surrounding them struggled with unemployment, weak infrastructure, and limited opportunities. These realities force many of us to ask difficult questions. How did a continent so rich in natural resources become economically dependent on others? How did agreements meant to create prosperity sometimes produce the opposite? And perhaps most importantly, how should leaders make decisions that affect millions of lives and billions of dollars in national resources? For some leaders, the answer is purely political. For others, it is economic. But for many of us in Africa today, the answer also involves something deeper. It involves moral responsibility before God. Across Africa, faith is not separate from life. It is part of how people understand justice, responsibility, and leadership. More than 9 out of 10 Africans believe in God. For them, leadership is not simply a position of authority. It is a sacred trust. When a leader signs a treaty that determines how a nation's resources will be used for decades, that decision does not only belong to history books, it belongs before the judgment of God. That is why some African leaders today say something that surprises the modern world. Before signing agreements that could shape the future of millions of people, they seek the guidance of God. Not as a ritual, not as a performance, but as a reminder that power must always remain humble before truth. I would like to explain why this belief has become so important for many of us. But to understand it fully, we must first look honestly at the history that brought Africa to this moment. And that history begins with a long series of treaties and agreements whose consequences are still shaping our continent today. Before I speak about faith, I must first speak about history. Because faith without memory becomes sentiment, and leadership without memory becomes dangerous. When many people outside Africa hear discussions about international treaties, they often imagine cooperation, development programs, and economic partnerships designed to help nations grow. But for many African countries, the memory of treaties is far more complicated. Sometimes those agreements brought investment, and infrastructure. But many times they also brought imbalance. They brought contracts that appeared beneficial at the moment of signing, but slowly transferred control of national resources away from the people who own the land. To understand why many African leaders now speak about moral responsibility before God when signing treaties, one must first understand how much has already been lost. From the early 1960s until the year 2020, Africa signed hundreds upon hundreds of mining contracts with foreign companies. According to reports from the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, more than 60% of mining agreements across the continent were signed with companies headquartered outside Africa. At first glance, such partnerships might appear natural. After all, large mining operations require technology, financing, and expertise. Many African governments believe that working with international companies would accelerate development, and in some cases, it did. But in many other cases, the balance of power during negotiations was not equal. Young nations emerging from colonial rule often lacked experienced negotiating teams. Some governments faced pressure from global institutions. Others faced political instability, debt, or economic emergencies. Under such conditions, contracts were sometimes signed that heavily favored external interest. Over time, the consequences became clearer. Reports estimate that Africa loses around $88 billion every year because of unfair resource agreements, illicit financial flows, and weak contract structures in the extractive industries. $88 billion. That number is difficult to imagine, but if we slow down and reflect, its meaning becomes clearer. $88 billion could build thousands of schools. It could build hospitals across entire regions. It could fund infrastructure that transforms economies for generations. Instead, much of that wealth left the continent. The minerals were extracted. The ships departed. The profits flowed outward. And the people living near those resources often remain poor. This reality is not a secret inside Africa. Farmers living near mining zones see trucks carrying minerals worth millions while their villages still struggle with electricity. Young people grow up knowing that their country possesses enormous wealth beneath the ground, yet opportunities remain limited. Such contradictions force leaders to confront difficult truths. Signing a treaty is not merely a technical process. It is an act that determines who benefits from the gifts that God placed in the soil of a nation. When a leader signs a contract that allows billions of dollars in resources to leave the country under unfair terms, that decision echoes for decades. It affects generations that have not yet been born. And that is where the moral dimension enters. Because leadership is not only about what is legal, it is also about what is right. In many African cultures, a leader is not viewed simply as an administrator. He is a guardian of land, a guardian of community, a guardian of the future. When we stand before a treaty that could transfer control of national resources for 20 or 30 years, we are not only negotiating with corporations or governments, we are standing between the past and the future. Behind us stand generations who protected that land before we were born. Before us stand children who will inherit whatever we decide. That awareness changes how one sees a signature. A signature is not simply ink. It is responsibility. It is history. It is judgment. Many leaders who came before us may have signed agreements believing they were helping their countries. But the results taught us painful lessons. Some contracts locked countries into arrangements where the majority of profits left the nation. Others gave companies control over strategic minerals under conditions that weakened national sovereignty. In several cases, governments later discovered that renegotiating those agreements was extremely difficult because once a treaty is signed, international legal systems protect those contracts. The cost of reversing them can be enormous. This is why decisions about treaties must be made with extreme caution. And this is precisely where faith begins to play a role. When a leader kneels in prayer before making such a decision, it is not because prayer magically solves political problems. It is because prayer forces a leader to confront his conscience. In prayer, a man remembers that power is temporary. In prayer, a man remembers that history will judge him. And in prayer, a man remembers that God sees what human institutions sometimes ignore. A leader who prays before signing a treaty asks a different set of questions. Not only will this agreement bring investment, but also, will this agreement protect the dignity of my people? Not only will this contract strengthen diplomatic relations, but also, will this contract honor the responsibility entrusted to me? Because wealth extracted from the earth is not just money, it is inheritance. It belongs not only to the present generation, but also to the future. And that is why the painful history of unfair treaties across Africa has led many leaders today to reconsider how decisions must be made, not only with economic calculations, not only with political strategies, but also with moral reflection. The lessons of the past have taught us that a leader who signs without conscience can cost his nation billions. But a leader who pauses to seek wisdom may protect generations. This is the first reason many African leaders today speak about seeking God's guidance before signing treaties. Because history has shown us the cost of decisions made without humility. And when we remember that history, we begin to understand why a simple moment of prayer can carry enormous weight. But the story does not end with economics. To truly understand why faith plays such a central role in African leadership today, we must also understand something deeper about the continent itself. We must understand the spiritual life of the people. When people in Western capitals analyze African politics, they often focus on economics, security alliances, and diplomatic strategy. Those things matter, of course. But there is another dimension that is often misunderstood or ignored entirely. It is the role of faith. In many African societies, faith is not something reserved only for houses of worship on weekends. It is woven into daily life. It shapes how people think about justice, responsibility, leadership, and the meaning of power. According to research conducted by the Pew Research Center, more than 90% of people across Africa believe in God. That number alone tells us something important. Faith is not a small part of the culture. It is one of the foundations of how society understands moral responsibility. This means that when leaders make decisions, those decisions are not judged only by economists or historians. They are judged by the conscience of the people. A president may sign a treaty in a government building, but millions of citizens will ask themselves a deeper question. Did this leader act with integrity? Did this leader act with humility? Did this leader remember that power is entrusted, not owned? For many Africans, the ultimate judge of those questions is not the international press, it is God. This belief changes the way leadership is understood. In many Western political systems, leadership is often framed as competition between parties, ideologies, and interests. But in much of Africa, leadership carries an additional dimension. It is seen as stewardship. A leader is entrusted with authority for a limited time. During that time, he must protect the land, the people, and the moral direction of the nation. The concept is ancient. Long before modern constitutions, many African societies believed that leaders held power only as long as they served the well-being of their communities. If a leader betrayed that responsibility, the community believed that both history and God would judge him. This cultural memory still lives in the minds of many citizens today. And that reality shapes how leaders must think about their role. When a president stands before his people, he does not speak only as a political figure. He speaks as someone who carries a moral obligation before God and society. This is why public prayer is not unusual in many African political events. Leaders pray before important national moments. They pray before elections. They pray during times of crisis. And they pray before making decisions that could affect the future of the country. To someone unfamiliar with African culture, this may appear symbolic, but to many citizens, it represents something deeper. It is a reminder that the leader recognizes he is not the highest authority. There is a power above him. This understanding can act as a powerful restraint on arrogance, because political power can easily create the illusion of control. When leaders command armies, sign laws, and negotiate international agreements, they may begin to feel that their authority is absolute. But faith interrupts that illusion. Faith reminds a leader that every decision carries moral weight. Faith reminds a leader that wealth and power are temporary. And faith reminds a leader that history is not the final judge. For many Africans, the final judge is God. This is why prayer before major national decisions carries meaning far beyond ceremony. When a leader bows his head in prayer, he is acknowledging that he does not possess perfect wisdom. He is acknowledging that political calculations alone cannot always reveal what is right. And he is acknowledging that millions of people depend on decisions that must be made carefully. In this sense, prayer becomes an act of humility. It is a moment where a leader steps away from political pressure, international negotiations, and economic calculations. In that quiet moment, he asks a simple question: am I making this decision for the good of my people? Or am I being influenced by fear, pressure, or ambition? The answer to that question cannot always be found in policy documents. Sometimes it must be found in the conscience. This is why faith remains deeply intertwined with leadership across the African continent. It provides a moral compass. It reminds leaders that authority is not permanent, and it encourages humility in moments when arrogance could easily take control. For me personally, this understanding became clearer as I observed the expectations of the people of Burkina Faso. When citizens look at their leaders, they do not only ask whether the economy is growing. They ask whether their leaders remember God. They ask whether those leaders respect justice. They ask whether power is being used for the people or for outside interests. These questions cannot be answered with statistics alone. They require moral clarity. And that moral clarity often begins with faith. This does not mean that prayer replaces policy. It does not replace careful negotiation or economic planning, but it does something equally important. It reminds leaders that every decision carries consequences beyond politics. A treaty signed today may shape the lives of children who have not yet been born. A resource contract may determine whether communities thrive or struggle decades from now. In such moments, leaders must look beyond immediate benefits. They must think about legacy. And faith helps many leaders keep that perspective. Because faith reminds us that while political power may last only a few years, responsibility before God lasts forever. This is why the spiritual dimension of leadership cannot be ignored when discussing Africa's future. It is not a secondary element. For millions of people, it is the foundation of trust. When leaders openly acknowledge their dependence on God's guidance, citizens see something important. They see humility, they see accountability, and they see a leader who understands that power is not the highest authority in the universe. But faith alone is not enough. Belief must also appear in action. Across Africa, several leaders have publicly spoken about seeking God's guidance before making national decisions. And those moments reveal how deeply faith can shape the way leaders approach responsibility. Faith becomes meaningful when it moves beyond words and enters the realm of decisions. Across Africa, people do not expect their leaders to speak about God only in ceremonies or symbolic moments. They expect leaders to remember God when the decisions are difficult. The real test of belief is not during celebrations. The real test appears when a leader must decide the future of his nation. Many African leaders understand this expectation very clearly. That is why it is not uncommon to hear presidents speak openly about prayer before important national decisions. Sometimes these moments happen quietly, away from cameras. Other times they appear in public speeches, but the message behind them remains the same. Power must serve both God and the people. I have spoken about this principle before in my own country. When I address the citizens of Burkina Faso, I remind them that political authority should never exist to serve external interests or personal ambition. Authority must serve the people, and above the people stands God. This idea is not meant to create religious division. Burkina Faso is home to Muslims, Christians, and followers of traditional African beliefs. Yet despite these differences, there is a shared understanding. Human beings do not possess ultimate power. There is always a higher moral authority. That awareness can protect a nation from dangerous mistakes, because political power carries enormous temptations. When a leader sits at a negotiating table with powerful governments, multinational corporations, and global institutions, the pressure can be overwhelming. Billions of dollars may be involved. International influence may be involved. The future of an entire economy may be involved. In those moments, leaders must decide whose interests they will protect. Will they protect the interests of their people? Or will they allow pressure from powerful actors to shape their decisions? Prayer can become a moment of clarity in those situations. Not because it magically removes all complexity, but because it forces the leader to pause. It forces him to remember the true purpose of leadership. Many African leaders have spoken about this responsibility in recent years. Some describe spending time in prayer before major announcements. Others speak about seeking guidance from religious leaders. Still others quietly reflect on Scripture before making decisions that could affect millions of lives. For many citizens, these moments matter deeply. They signal that leadership is not being exercised with arrogance. They signal that the leader understands he is accountable not only to voters, but also to moral truth. And this accountability can shape how decisions are made. When a leader remembers that his authority exists under God, he becomes more cautious about signing agreements that could harm his people. He becomes more careful about promises made by powerful partners. He becomes more attentive to the long-term consequences of short-term gains. In my own reflections, I often think about the meaning of responsibility. Leadership is sometimes portrayed as a position of strength, but in truth, leadership often feels like carrying a great weight, because every decision can shape the lives of millions. When you sign a document that affects national resources, you are not signing for yourself. You are signing for farmers in rural villages. You are signing for workers in cities. You are signing for children who will inherit the country decades later. That awareness changes the way one approaches decisions. It forces humility, and humility often leads a person toward prayer. In prayer, a leader is reminded of something important. He is reminded that wisdom does not belong only to political institutions. True wisdom often requires reflection, patience, and moral courage. These qualities cannot be purchased. They must be cultivated, and for many believers, they are strengthened through faith. This is why some African leaders openly state that political authority must serve God and the people. It is not a slogan. It is a reminder that leadership without conscience can easily become exploitation, a reminder that power without humility can easily become corruption, and a reminder that decisions made in a moment can affect generations. Across Africa today, this perspective is slowly gaining strength. Many citizens are asking deeper questions about how treaties are negotiated. They are asking whether national resources are being protected. They are asking whether leaders are thinking about the future rather than immediate benefits. And these questions are encouraging a new culture of accountability. Faith plays a role in that process. Because when leaders publicly acknowledge God's authority, they are reminding themselves that they cannot hide behind technical language or legal contracts. At the end of the day, leadership will always return to a simple moral question. Did you protect your people, or did you allow their inheritance to be taken away? This is why prayer before major decisions is not merely symbolic. It is a moment where a leader confronts his conscience. It is a moment where he remembers the weight of responsibility. And it is a moment where he asks for wisdom greater than his own. But even the most sincere prayer cannot erase the lessons of history. Africa's past contains many painful examples of how resource decisions can shape entire nations. Some of the most powerful lessons come from countries that possess enormous natural wealth but struggled to benefit from it. One of the most striking examples lies in the heart of Central Africa, a country whose soil holds some of the most valuable minerals on earth, yet whose people have often struggled to control that wealth. To understand why African leaders today speak so carefully about treaties and resources, we must look closely at that story, because it reveals how decisions made far away from communities can reshape entire nations. There is a lesson that echoes across the African continent, and it is a lesson written not in books, but in the soil itself. That lesson is simple. A nation can possess enormous natural wealth and still struggle if it does not control how that wealth is used. Many people around the world assume that natural resources automatically create prosperity. Gold, diamonds, cobalt, oil, and rare minerals appear to promise wealth beyond imagination. But history shows something more complicated. If the management of those resources is weak, if treaties are signed without careful protection of national interests, the wealth beneath the ground can enrich others more than the people who live above it. One of the most powerful examples of this reality is found in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This vast country in Central Africa deposits on Earth. Among those resources is cobalt, a mineral that has become essential in modern technology. Cobalt is used in batteries that power electric vehicles, smartphones, and many other devices that define the modern young economy. The Democratic Republic of Congo possesses roughly 70% of the world's cobalt reserves. 70%. When one hears such a number, it is easy to imagine enormous national prosperity. A country controlling such a resource should logically stand at the center of the global technology economy. Yet the reality has often been far more complex. For many years, a large portion of the profits generated by Congo's mineral wealth flowed to companies headquartered outside the country. International corporations controlled major operations. Contracts signed during different political eras allowed foreign companies significant access to these strategic resources. While some revenue reached the state, the balance of profit often favored external actors. The result was a paradox that became familiar across many parts of Africa. The land was rich. The minerals were valuable, but the communities surrounding those mines did not always experience the prosperity that such resources should have brought. This situation did not emerge overnight. It developed through decades of political instability, complex negotiations, and international economic pressures. Some agreements were signed during times when governments faced urgent financial needs. Others were signed when negotiating teams lacked the experience or leverage required to secure more balanced terms. And once those agreements were in place, reversing them became extremely difficult. International contracts carry legal protections. Breaking them can lead to costly legal battles and diplomatic conflict. As a result, countries sometimes find themselves bound to agreements that no longer reflect their national interests. This is why the story of resource control has become one of the most important lessons for modern African leadership. It teaches that the value of minerals is not determined only by their market price. It is determined by who controls the conditions under which those minerals are extracted. It is determined by who decides how profits are distributed. And it is determined by whether the people living on that land benefit from the wealth beneath it. When those questions are ignored, the consequences can last for generations. And that is why many African leaders today approach resource treaties with much greater caution than in the past. Because every contract carries long shadows. A mining agreement signed today might remain in effect for 20 or 30 years. During that time, millions of tons of minerals may leave the country. Entire industries may be built around those resources. And by the time a nation realizes the long-term consequences, changing the situation may be extremely difficult. This is where moral reflection becomes essential, because treaties are not merely technical documents written in legal language. They are decisions that shape the destiny of nations. When a leader signs an agreement concerning strategic minerals, he is determining how national inheritance will be used. Will that inheritance strengthen the country? Or will it slowly slip beyond national control? The example of Congo reminds us that resource wealth alone does not guarantee prosperity. What matters most is governance. What matters most is wisdom. And wisdom requires more than economic calculations. It requires foresight. It requires humility. And for many leaders, it requires prayer. Prayer does not replace careful negotiation. But it can remind a leader to think beyond immediate pressure. It can remind him to ask deeper questions. Are we protecting the long-term interests of our people? Are we ensuring that our resources serve the nation? Are we acting with integrity before history and before God? These questions may sound philosophical, but they carry very real consequences. Because the resources of Africa are not only valuable today, they will remain valuable for generations. And the decisions made by leaders today will determine whether those resources become a blessing or a burden. Across the continent, citizens have become increasingly aware of these issues. Young people study the history of mining agreements. Communities demand greater transparency. Governments are being asked to renegotiate contracts that were signed decades earlier. This growing awareness is shaping a new generation of leadership. Leaders who understand that the management of natural resources is not merely an economic matter. It is a matter of national dignity, and when dignity is involved, decisions must be made with extreme care. Because once a nation loses control over its resources, regaining that control can take many years, sometimes even generations. This is why discussions about treaties in Africa today are no longer limited to financial negotiations. There are also discussions about sovereignty, about justice, and about responsibility before future generations. But to fully understand the weight of these decisions, we must also recognize something else. Resource treaties do not only affect governments and corporations, they affect ordinary people. They affect communities who live near those resources. They affect the environment, the land, and the future of families who depend on it. In many cases, a single major mining agreement can influence the lives of millions of people. And once we understand that reality, the responsibility carried by leaders becomes even clearer. Because signing a treaty is never only about economics. It is about people. It is about land. It is about the future. When people hear the phrase international agreement, they often imagine a document discussed by diplomats in quiet rooms far away from everyday life. But the truth is very different. A single treaty can reach far beyond government buildings. It can reach villages, cities, rivers, forests, and the lives of millions of people who may never see the document that affects them. This is something every responsible leader must remember, because a treaty concerning natural resources does not remain confined to legal language. It eventually becomes roads, trucks, factories, mines, and communities transformed by economic activity. In many parts of Africa, large mining projects take place in regions where millions of people live and work. Farmers cultivate land near mineral deposits. Families rely on nearby water sources. Entire local economies depend on the environment surrounding those resources. When a mining treaty is signed, it may open the door for massive industrial operations. Heavy machinery arrives. Road networks are expanded. Foreign engineers and companies enter the region. At first glance, this can bring opportunity. Jobs may appear. Local businesses may grow. Infrastructure may improve. But the long-term outcome depends on how carefully the agreement was designed. If environmental protections are weak, land may become damaged. If community rights are ignored, local populations may lose access to land they depended on for generations. If profit-sharing structures are unfair, the wealth generated by the resource may leave the country without improving the lives of the people living there. These are not theoretical concerns. They are realities experienced in many parts of the world, including Africa. This is why leaders must think beyond immediate economic promises when negotiating treaties, because the effects of those decisions can extend across entire regions. In some cases, more than 20 million people may live near or depend on areas affected by major resource projects. 20 million lives. When one thinks carefully about that number, the weight of responsibility becomes clear. A treaty is no longer simply a political act. It becomes a decision about communities, families, and future generations. Will those communities benefit from development? Will their environment be protected? Will their children inherit opportunity or hardship? These questions cannot be ignored, and this is precisely where the search for wisdom becomes essential. Economic advisors can present projections, legal experts can draft contracts, diplomats can negotiate terms. But the final decision still rests with leaders, and leaders must think about something larger than technical details. They must think about human consequences. A leader who approaches treaties only as economic opportunities may overlook these deeper responsibilities. But a leader who pauses to reflect on the moral weight of his decisions begins to see the situation differently. He begins to realize that leadership is not merely about growth statistics. It is about stewardship of land, stewardship of resources, stewardship of human dignity. When a leader views his role in this way, he becomes more careful. He listens more closely to communities. He studies agreements more thoroughly, and he becomes more cautious about promises that appear generous but may hide long-term costs. Faith can strengthen this sense of responsibility, because faith reminds leaders that human lives are not numbers in economic models. They are people created by God, families who deserve justice, communities who deserve dignity, future generations who deserve opportunity. When leaders remember this truth, treaties take on a deeper meaning. They become moral decisions, decisions that must be made with wisdom, humility, and a clear conscience. In many African traditions, leaders were historically expected to protect the well-being of their people before considering any external alliance. This expectation still lives in the hearts of citizens today. People want to know that their leaders remember them when negotiating agreements. They want to know that decisions made in distant conference rooms will not harm the communities who live closest to the resources. This trust is fragile. Once broken, it can take decades to restore. That is why the responsibility of leadership must never be treated lightly. When leaders gather to sign agreements involving national resources, they are not merely concluding negotiations. They are shaping the future of real human lives. And for those who believe in God, this awareness becomes even more powerful. Because faith reminds us that every human life carries value. Every community carries dignity. And every decision affecting millions must be approached with deep humility. This humility does not weaken leadership, it strengthens it. Because humility allows leaders to recognize their limitations. It allows them to seek wisdom. And it reminds them that power must always serve the people. Across Africa today, many citizens are asking their leaders to remember these responsibilities. They want transparency, they want fairness, and they want decisions that protect both resources and communities. These expectations are shaping a new culture of leadership, one where treaties are not rushed, one where agreements are studied carefully, and one where leaders understand that signing a document is only the beginning of a long chain of consequences. But responsibility does not end with protecting resources or communities. There is another dimension that every leader must confront: the moral responsibility that comes with power itself, because leadership is not only about what we do, it is also about who we become while holding authority. Leadership can easily create distance between a leader and the ordinary life of the people. A president sits in offices, attends international meetings, signs official documents, and speaks on behalf of the nation. Over time, this position can begin to feel like a world separate from the daily struggles of farmers, workers, and families. This is one of the hidden dangers of power. The more authority a person holds, the easier it becomes to forget the simple truths that shape ordinary life. Faith has often served as a bridge that reconnects leaders with those truths. Across many African cultures, leadership has never been viewed only as a position of control. It has always been viewed as a responsibility before both the community and God. A chief, a king, or a president may carry authority, but that authority is understood as a trust that must be exercised with wisdom, a trust that must protect the well-being of the people, and a trust that will eventually be judged. This understanding creates a powerful form of moral accountability. Because when a leader believes that his actions will one day stand before God, he begins to examine his decisions differently. He asks himself questions that go beyond politics. Did I act with honesty? Did I protect those who could not defend themselves? Did I use power for the good of the people or for personal gain? These questions are not written in law books, but they live deeply in the conscience, and conscience can be one of the most powerful guides for leadership. Throughout Africa's long history, communities have expected leaders to demonstrate humility before spiritual authority. This humility was not considered weakness. It was considered wisdom. A leader who believed himself above all judgment was viewed as dangerous, but a leader who remembered that he stood under the authority of God was seen as trustworthy. This idea still influences modern expectations of leadership across the continent. Citizens want to see that their leaders remember the moral dimension of power. They want to know that authority is being exercised with humility and restraint. And faith can help maintain that perspective. Prayer, reflection, and spiritual guidance create moments where leaders pause. In those moments, they step away from political competition and external pressures. They remember why they were entrusted with authority in the first place. This pause can change the way decisions are made. Because when a leader approaches power with humility, he becomes more cautious about actions that could harm the nation. He becomes more attentive to justice. He becomes more aware of the long-term consequences of his choices. Faith also reminds leaders that their position is temporary. No president remains in office forever. No government lasts indefinitely. Political authority always passes from one generation to another. But the consequences of leadership decisions can remain long after power has changed hands. A mining contract signed today may still shape a nation's economy 20 or 30 years from now. A diplomatic agreement may influence international relationships for decades. A decision about natural resources may determine whether future generations inherit prosperity or struggle. These realities create an enormous moral responsibility because leaders are not deciding only for themselves. They are deciding for people who may never know their names. Children who grow up under the conditions created by those decisions. Communities that will either benefit or suffer depending on how wisely power was used. Faith encourages leaders to remember those unseen faces. It reminds them that every decision carries human consequences. It reminds them that justice must guide authority. And it reminds them that leadership is ultimately about service. Service to the people, service to truth, and service to the moral principles that sustain society. Without these reminders, power can easily become self-serving. History is filled with examples of leaders who forgot their responsibility. Some pursued wealth, others pursued prestige. Still others allowed external interest to influence decisions that should have protected their nations. The consequences of such choices often lasted for generations. This is why many African leaders today speak openly about the need for moral grounding. They understand that economic policy and diplomatic strategy must be guided by ethical principles. And for millions of Africans, those principles are deeply connected to faith. Faith does not provide easy answers to complex political questions, but it can provide clarity about values. It can remind leaders that certain principles must never be sacrificed: integrity, justice, responsibility. These values cannot be replaced by economic calculations alone, because a nation's strength does not depend only on its wealth. It also depends on the character of its leadership. When leaders remain connected to moral principles, their decisions tend to reflect long-term thinking. They become less willing to trade national interest for short-term benefit. They become more attentive to the voices of their citizens, and they become more careful about agreements that could weaken sovereignty. In this way, faith can serve as a compass, not a political tool, but a reminder of moral direction. A compass that helps leaders navigate the difficult terrain of modern geopolitics. The world today is full of competing interests. Powerful nations pursue strategic advantages. Corporations seek access to valuable resources. International institutions promote policies that influence national decisions. In such an environment, leaders must remain grounded. They must remember who they represent. And they must remain faithful to the principles that protect their people. Faith helps many leaders maintain that grounding. It reminds them that authority must never lose its moral foundation. And it reminds them that the ultimate measure of leadership is not power, but service. Yet, even with strong moral guidance, one truth remains unavoidable. Political power is temporary. Every leader eventually leaves office. Every government eventually changes. And this reality carries an important lesson for anyone who holds authority. A lesson that many African leaders have begun to emphasize more openly in recent years. Power may be temporary, but responsibility before God is eternal. And understanding this truth can transform the way leaders approach their role. There is a truth that every leader eventually learns. No matter how powerful a government may appear, no matter how strong an army may be, no matter how influential a nation becomes, political power never lasts forever. History teaches this lesson again and again. Empires that once seemed unstoppable eventually disappeared. Governments that dominated entire regions eventually faded. Leaders who commanded enormous authority eventually returned to being ordinary human beings. Power always moves from one generation to another. This reality is not something to fear. It is something to remember. Because when leaders remember that their time in office is temporary, they begin to see their responsibilities more clearly. A presidency may last a few years. A political career may last a few decades. but the consequences of decisions made during that time can shape the destiny of a nation for generations. This is especially true when it comes to international treaties. When a leader signs a treaty involving national resources, that document may remain active long after the leader himself has left office. 20 years, 30 years, sometimes even longer. During that time, entire industries may develop. Billions of dollars in minerals may be extracted. Communities may be transformed. The effects ripple forward into the future. And by the time a later generation of leaders tries to revisit those agreements, the situation may already be deeply entrenched. This is why the act of signing a treaty carries such profound weight, because it binds the future. It shapes possibilities that will affect people who had no voice in the original decision. And when leaders understand this, they begin to recognize something important. Their authority is temporary, but their responsibility is lasting. For people of faith, this understanding goes even deeper. Because faith reminds us that human history is not the final measure of our actions. There is another dimension, the dimension of moral accountability before God. In many African speeches, a phrase appears again and again. Political power is temporary, but responsibility before God is eternal. This phrase is not meant to frighten leaders. It is meant to remind them of humility. A president may command institutions, but he cannot command time. One day his term will end. One day history will evaluate his decisions. And beyond history, faith teaches that God also sees what was done with the authority entrusted to him. Did he protect his people? Did he defend the dignity of his nation? Did he use power wisely? These questions cannot be answered by political speeches. They are answered by the consequences of decisions. If a leader signs agreements that weaken his country's sovereignty, history will record that. If he allows national resources to be exploited unfairly, the evidence will remain in the lives of the people. But if he acts with integrity, courage, and humility, those qualities will also leave their mark. The awareness of this responsibility can transform how leaders approach their role. Instead of viewing power as an opportunity for personal legacy, they begin to view it as a trust given for a limited time, a trust that must be exercised carefully, and a trust that must eventually be returned. When leaders carry this perspective, they approach decisions with greater patience. They become less concerned with immediate applause. They become more concerned with long-term justice. They ask themselves how their actions will appear not only today, but many years from now. This perspective can also protect leaders from the pressure of powerful external interests, because international negotiations often involve strong influence. Large nations seek strategic advantages. Corporations seek profitable opportunities. Financial institutions seek stability for global markets. All of these forces can create pressure on leaders to accept agreements that may not fully serve their countries. In such moments, remembering the temporary nature of power becomes important, because it reminds leaders that they are not in office to satisfy external expectations. They are in office to protect their people. And if protecting the people requires patience, courage, or even resistance to pressure, then that is the responsibility leadership demands. Faith strengthens this resolve. It reminds leaders that the final measure of their decisions will not be applause from powerful allies. It will be justice, justice before history, and justice before God. This understanding encourages leaders to seek wisdom before acting, to study treaties carefully, to listen to advisors with integrity, to hear the voices of their citizens, and sometimes to step away from negotiations for a moment of reflection. In that quiet moment, a leader may ask himself a simple question. When my time in office is over, will my people say that I protected their future? Or will they say that I allowed their inheritance to slip away? The answer to that question often determines the path forward. And this is why many African leaders today emphasize moral responsibility when discussing national decisions. They know that the world is watching, but more importantly, they know that future generations are depending on them. The child born today will grow up in the country shaped by the decisions we make now. That child will inherit the consequences of the treaties signed in this generation. This awareness can be both humbling and motivating. It reminds leaders that their role is not to dominate history. Their role is to serve it, to protect what belongs to the nation, to strengthen what has been entrusted to them, and to leave the country stronger than they found it. Across Africa today, this perspective is slowly gaining strength. Many citizens are demanding transparency. They are asking their leaders to protect sovereignty. They are studying the lessons of the past, and they are encouraging a new generation of leadership to think differently about power. But this transformation is not happening by accident. It is also being driven by the emergence of a younger generation of leaders across the continent. Leaders who grew up studying the history of Africa's economic struggles. Leaders who speak openly about sovereignty, accountability, and moral responsibility. And leaders who believe that the mistakes of the past must not be repeated. Their voices are beginning to reshape the conversation about leadership in Africa. History moves slowly, but sometimes a generation arrives that begins to ask new questions. Across Africa today, such a generation is emerging. These leaders did not grow up in the early years after independence. They grew up studying what happened during those decades. They studied the treaties that shaped the continent's economies. They studied the promises that were made and the outcomes that followed. And many of them reached the same conclusion. Africa must learn from its past. For decades, development across the continent was often shaped by external agreements. Trade partnerships, mining contracts, security arrangements, and financial programs all influenced national decisions. Some of these partnerships created opportunities. Others created dependency. As time passed, citizens began asking deeper questions. Why were countries rich in resources still struggling economically? Why were communities living near valuable minerals often among the poorest regions? Why did agreements that promised prosperity sometimes produce the opposite? These questions gradually influenced public debate. Universities began studying the economics of extractive industries more carefully. Civil society organizations demanded greater transparency in contracts. Young people started examining how natural resources were managed, and as this awareness spread, it began shaping political expectations. Citizens wanted leaders who would protect sovereignty. They wanted leaders who would negotiate treaties carefully, and they wanted leaders who would remember the moral responsibility that comes with power. This environment helped give rise to a new generation of African leadership. A generation that speaks openly about three central principles: national sovereignty, transparency in international agreements, and ethical responsibility toward the people. These ideas are not entirely new. African thinkers have spoken about them for many years. But what is different now is the urgency with which they are being expressed. Young leaders today grew up seeing the consequences of past mistakes. They saw how certain contracts allowed enormous wealth to leave the continent. They saw how communities struggled while valuable resources were extracted from their land. And they concluded that the future must be different. This perspective does not mean rejecting cooperation with the world. Africa is part of the global community. Trade, investment, and international partnerships remain essential for development, but cooperation must be balanced. Agreements must protect national interests, and negotiations must be conducted with clarity and fairness. This is where transparency becomes important. In the past, many resource contracts were negotiated behind closed doors. Citizens often had little information about the details of agreements that affected their country's wealth. Today, many African societies are demanding a different approach. They want contracts to be studied publicly. They want institutions that monitor how resources are managed. And they want leaders who will explain the decisions being made. This shift toward transparency creates accountability. It reminds leaders that treaties are not private arrangements between governments and corporations. They are decisions that affect the entire nation. And when citizens are informed, leaders must negotiate more carefully. They must ensure that agreements truly benefit the country. The new generation of leaders also places greater emphasis on sovereignty. Sovereignty means that a nation retains control over its resources, its policies, and its future. It means that decisions about national wealth must prioritize the well-being of the people. This idea has become increasingly important as Africa's natural resources grow more valuable in the modern global economy. Minerals used in advanced technology, renewable energy, and modern infrastructure are found in many parts of the continent. As global demand for these materials increases, the pressure to access them also grows. This makes responsible leadership even more critical because the world may seek Africa's resources, but it is the responsibility of African leaders to ensure that those resources benefit African societies. This is where moral responsibility returns to the conversation. A leader who negotiates from a purely transactional perspective may focus only on immediate financial gains, but a leader who understands his moral responsibility thinks about the future. He asks whether the agreement strengthens national independence. He asks whether communities will benefit. He asks whether the land will remain protected for generations. Faith can play an important role in maintaining this perspective because faith reminds leaders that leadership is not simply about strategy. It is also about integrity. It reminds them that authority is a trust given for the purpose of serving others. And it reminds them that decisions made today will one day be examined by history and by God. Across Africa, this combination of sovereignty, transparency, and moral responsibility is slowly shaping a new political culture. Citizens expect their leaders to protect national dignity. They expect them to negotiate treaties with courage and wisdom. And they expect them to remember that the wealth of a nation belongs to the people. This transformation will not happen overnight. Changing systems built over decades takes time. But the direction is becoming clearer. Africa is entering a new chapter where leadership is increasingly measured not only by economic performance, but by moral integrity. Leaders are being asked to demonstrate humility before power. to act as guardians of national resources, and to ensure that agreements signed today do not repeat the mistakes of the past. This is why discussions about treaties now often include a spiritual dimension. Because when leaders understand that they are accountable before God as well as before their citizens, their decisions can become more careful, more thoughtful, more responsible. And this brings us to the final reflection in this journey, a reflection that connects everything we have discussed. The history of unfair treaties, the role of faith, the responsibility of leadership, and the emergence of a new generation determined to protect the future. At the center of all these ideas lies a simple act that carries deep meaning. The act of prayer before signing decisions that may shape the destiny of nations. And understanding that act leads us to the final lesson. After everything we have discussed, the history, the lessons, the struggles, and the hopes for a better future, we return to a simple image. A leader sitting quietly before signing an agreement. The room is silent. The documents are ready. Advisors wait nearby. Diplomats expect the signature that will finalize months, sometimes years, of negotiation. And before the pen touches the paper, the leader pauses. He lowers his head. He prays. To some observers, this moment may appear symbolic. To others, it may appear unnecessary. But for many African leaders, that pause carries profound meaning. Because prayer in that moment is not about ritual. It is about remembering responsibility. The leader understands that what he's about to sign is not just another government document. It is a decision that may influence millions of people. It may determine how billions of dollars in national resources will be used. It may shape the economic direction of the country for decades. In that quiet moment of prayer, the leader reminds himself of something important. This decision is bigger than politics. It is bigger than personal reputation. It is about the future of the nation. Prayer creates a moment of humility. It interrupts the rush of negotiations and calculations. It forces the leader to step back and look at the decision through a moral lens. He asks himself questions that cannot always be answered by economic models. Is this agreement fair to my people? Does it protect the dignity of the nation? Will future generations look back on this decision with gratitude or regret? These questions are not easy. They require honesty, and honesty requires humility. Prayer helps create that humility, because when a leader prays, he acknowledges that he does not possess perfect wisdom. He acknowledges that the consequences of his decisions may extend far beyond what he can predict. And he acknowledges that guidance is needed, guidance not only from advisors and experts, but also from moral reflection. In this way, prayer becomes a safeguard, not a guarantee of perfection, but a reminder of conscience. It reminds the leader that power must always remain accountable to something higher. Across Africa today, this idea is gaining strength. Citizens are asking their leaders to approach decisions with humility and responsibility. They want to know that treaties are not signed casually. They want to know that national resources are being protected carefully. And they want to know that leaders understand the moral weight of their authority. Prayer before signing an agreement sends a message. It tells the people that the leader recognizes the seriousness of the decision. It tells them that the leader is not acting only as a politician. He is acting as a guardian of the nation's future. This understanding also creates unity across different faiths. Africa is home to Muslims, Christians, and many traditional spiritual communities. But across these traditions, there is a shared belief human power is limited. Wisdom must be sought, and leadership must be exercised with humility. When leaders pray before making major decisions, they are acknowledging this shared truth. They are recognizing that the future of a nation cannot be treated lightly, and they are reminding themselves that leadership is a sacred trust, a trust given by the people, a trust observed by history, and for believers, a trust witnessed by God. This perspective helps prevent the mistakes of the past. It encourages leaders to think carefully about treaties, to study agreements thoroughly, to protect sovereignty, and to ensure that the wealth of the nation serves its people. Africa's history contains painful lessons. Resources were sometimes exploited. Agreements sometimes favored external interests. Communities sometimes struggled while wealth left their land. But history also provides guidance. It teaches that the future can be different if leaders learn from the past, if they approach power with humility, if they protect their people with courage, and if they remember that their decisions carry moral weight. This is why prayer before signing a treaty is not merely a religious act. It is a moment of reflection, a moment where a leader remembers the faces of millions of citizens, farmers working the land, children attending school, families building their future. And he asks himself whether the decision he is about to make will serve them. Because in the end, leadership is not measured by speeches or titles. It is measured by the lives of the people, by whether a nation grows stronger, by whether communities gain opportunity, by whether the inheritance of the land is protected. And when leaders remember these truths, the act of signing a treaty becomes something much deeper. It becomes a commitment to justice, a commitment to responsibility, and a commitment to the future. This is the lesson that many African leaders are trying to carry forward today. A lesson shaped by history, strengthened by faith, and guided by the hope that the next generation will inherit a continent that is stronger, fairer, and more sovereign than before. And it is with that hope that I now speak directly to the world. When I look at the history of our continent, I do not see only struggle. I also see endurance. Africa has lived through centuries of pressure, conflict, and exploitation, yet the spirit of its people has never disappeared. Our land still carries enormous beauty. Our cultures still carry deep wisdom. And our people still carry faith, faith that justice matters, faith that truth matters, faith that leadership must serve something greater than itself. I speak today not to accuse anyone and not to divide nations. The world is deeply interconnected. No continent can walk forward alone. Africa needs cooperation with the world, and the world benefits from cooperation with Africa. Trade can bring prosperity. Investment can build industries. Partnerships can create opportunities for millions of people. But cooperation must be based on fairness. It must respect sovereignty. And it must remember the dignity of the people who live on the land where resources are found. For too long, decisions about Africa were sometimes made without listening to Africa. That time must come to an end. The new generation of African leadership understands something very clearly. We are not guardians of power for ourselves. We are guardians of the future for our people. When we negotiate treaties, we are not negotiating only with companies or governments. We are negotiating with history. Every agreement we sign becomes part of the story that future generations will inherit. That awareness requires humility. It requires courage. And it requires moral clarity. This is why faith remains important in leadership across Africa. Faith reminds us that power is temporary. Faith reminds us that every human life carries value. Faith reminds us that decisions made in offices today will shape communities tomorrow. Whether one prays in a mosque or in a church, whether one speaks the language of Islam or the language of Christianity, the message is often the same. Leadership is a responsibility before God. When leaders remember this truth, their decisions change. They become more careful with the resources of their nations. They become more attentive to the voices of their people. And they become more determined to protect the dignity of their countries. This is the path many of us are trying to follow today. Not perfectly, because no leader is perfect, but sincerely, with the understanding that every generation must try to correct the mistakes of the past. Africa's future will not be built only by governments. It will also be built by citizens. Young people studying science and engineering, farmers cultivating the land, teachers educating the next generation, entrepreneurs building businesses, religious leaders guiding communities toward compassion and justice. Each of these people carries a part of the continent's future, and that future must be protected with wisdom. To the Muslim world, I say this with respect. Your faith teaches submission to the will of God and justice among people. Those values strengthen leadership when they guide decisions. To Christians around the world, I say this with sincerity. The teachings of Jesus speak about humility, service, and truth. Those teachings remind leaders that authority must serve the weak, not exploit them. To the leaders of the Sahel, I say this as a brother. Our region faces many challenges, from security concerns to economic development. But our greatest strength is unity. If we protect our sovereignty, respect our people, and seek wisdom in our decisions, the future can be brighter than the past. And to the wider world, I say this with hope. Africa does not ask for pity. Africa asks for partnership based on respect. Partnership where agreements benefit both sides. Partnership where the dignity of nations is recognized. Partnership where the resources of the land help build prosperity for the people who live there. This is not an impossible dream. It is a practical vision. A vision where cooperation replaces exploitation, where transparency replaces secrecy, and where leadership remembers that power is a trust. But none of this can happen if the human heart remains filled with greed, deception, and indifference. The problems of the world are not only political, they are also moral. When leaders pursue power without conscience, nations suffer. When individuals pursue wealth without justice, communities suffer. But when people choose integrity, societies begin to change. That change begins inside the human heart. Each of us must ask ourselves a simple question. Are we contributing to truth or to deception? Are we building justice or ignoring injustice? Are we helping the world move toward peace or allowing division to grow? These questions are not only for presidents. They are for every human being, because the future of the world will be shaped not only by leaders, but by the moral choices of ordinary people. If we want a better future for Africa, for Europe, for America, for Asia, and for the entire human family, we must return to the principles that sustain civilization: honesty, compassion, responsibility, faith, These values are not owned by any one nation or religion. They belong to humanity. And when we live by them, we begin to heal the divisions that weaken the world. My hope is simple. I hope that Africa will rise not only in economic strength, but also in moral clarity. I hope that future leaders will remember the lessons of history. I hope that the wealth of our land will help lift our people rather than leave them behind. And I hope that nations across the world will work together with fairness and respect, because the destiny of humanity is shared. No nation stands alone on this planet. Our choices affect one another, and our future will be built together. If these reflections speak to your heart, then let them continue as a conversation. Share your thoughts, speak about justice, encourage leaders to act with integrity. And if you believe that messages about faith, responsibility, and moral leadership should reach more people, then continue following these discussions so that the conversation can grow. Sometimes the smallest voice can inspire the largest change. And sometimes a single reflection can remind someone of the path toward truth. Before I finish, I want to repeat one final message. Not as a political statement, but as a personal conviction. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso. What I have spoken here is the truth.